Hello, class. The video's finally being made. Thank you for your patience. And as soon as I finish this one, I'm going to start recording next week's because this cannot happen again. I'm Dr. Davis. Hello. This is my office in Connecticut where I'm the chair of Africana Studies for the University of Hartford. So here I am in a different state, but it's nice to meet you all. It's been really great following your discussions in the first forum. I'll be back on that tonight and throughout tomorrow because my classes are ending. I'm so excited. Um, and I'm always really excited to come back and teach at Wayne State. For those of you who read my first post in the forum, I graduated from Wayne State, wow, almost 13 years, no, 13 years ago next year, right? So it's been a while. But this class was probably one of my most memorable experiences as an Africana Studies major. So it's a true honor to be teaching Africana Studies or African American Studies now, 2600. So I'm grateful for Dr. Ali Johnson, the chair of the department, and many others for really believing that I could do this and come back home and whatnot. But more so, I'm excited to hear more about you and some of your questions because that always gets me going. But in any case, for week one's content, we're really just jumping into the conversation about race and racism. The first question I really want us to focus on is what is race? What is racism? And again, for those of you who read my post, you might have seen some of my own uh, complex questions about this idea of racism because I live in a town in western Massachusetts that is predominantly, well, it's about half and half white, and you'll understand why I put air quotes around that now after you take the class, and Puerto Rican, largely, or Latinx, another category that we're told is a matter of race. But in any case, living in that area and being one of a very small percentage of people of African descent there, it's very interesting to engage in conversations about race because even the question of like saying, like, did you notice this thing in the news about police brutality or, like it was kind of strange the way that waitress just spoke to our Puerto Rican neighbor and customer or, person who's also here. And those conversations get switched into like, why are you bringing up racist conversations? And I'm like, I don't recall it being racist to point out racism or issues regarding racial discrimination, but I think that's why this is an important moment to have this class and to take this class because if we talk about race and racism in America, it's important that our conversations are measured because after those questions, I was able to have meaningful, empathetic conversations with many of those people, not all of them. I'm not going to sit here and lie to you. But I noticed that there was room for conversation if we have language, if we're willing to connect with somebody else on a human level. And so, with that being said, this is why I start every class with Bobby Harrow's Cycle of Socialization. And there's an attached file that I'm putting on tonight called the Social Identity Wheel. You do not have to complete this for me. It is ungraded. It's just for your consideration to view after you read Bobby Harrow's article. And the reason I use this article in my classes is because she really hones in on this idea or this reality really of there being a set of social cues that we are born into, whether we're white or black, heterosexual or LGBTQ, we are born into a world that encourages and endorses hierarchical levels of power based on who we are, how we present, how we look, the color of our skin, how much, what our abilities are, whether we're differently abled or able-bodied. whether we're like petite persons or large persons. Like there are entire social systems set up to ensure or reinforce our places in society. And by that, let's consider the negotiations regarding the policing of perhaps how much poor people are able to spend, because of the access some poor people have to aid. So like, oh, you shouldn't have a cell phone because you don't make this much or because you're applying for aid. In this world, especially if you're a person of a certain age and you have children of certain ages, when does it become a privilege to own a form of communication? Why shouldn't a child in a low income household own a video game? Is she not a child? Is this not something that children can have? And if a parent can provide it, why shouldn't that child have it? And so there are many areas that become blurred when we consider that it's part of a system and that like the idea of power and privilege go hand in hand with oppression, regardless of the type of oppression a person experiences. And it's always important too to note that this idea of socialization is also linked with intersectionality. And that just means, too, that within multiple identities, we can align ourselves with being a person who possesses some power. For me, I possess some power with regard to things like my citizenship. And currently now, my social economic status and also my religious beliefs. Because it is believed in this country that the predominant religion is Christian or Christian-based. When I go outside and pray, I don't have to worry about somebody judging me for that prayer. Quite often, I can wear a cross like this one and not be harassed or harangued or violated because of the faith that I practice. That's a privilege. It's nothing less than that, especially when we really think about the experiences of other people and express some empathy. And that's an important word. All right. And beyond that, looking at those areas where we're targets. For instance, I am obviously a woman. I present as femme. I am cis hetero. And I'm obviously a person of color. Two things taken together and taken apart that come with their own sets of challenges. And so that's what the social identity wheel presents. That is the point of what Bobby Harrow is doing in that short article. And I will facilitate some questions to you within the next day or so that try to get you to think more critically about what you're reading. Because there's me telling you this and there's what you're reading. But I also want to be clear that you are asking questions, that you are being critical, like not necessarily agreeing because you think I want you to agree. Like, no, I want you to ask questions that might perplex you or confound you or even challenge some of the things that you believe or thought you believed. So that's why I'm here. I'm an educator. All right. So beyond that, the question of what is race before we jump headlong into racism is really on the top of my head because even though I teach in Black Studies, I run a whole department, I got all this Black stuff behind me, I don't think very often about the definition of racism. When it comes up, I get a little annoyed because I'm like, oh, it's a social construct, much like I see gender as one now, having come into adulthood and met many forms of, human expression, I will say, without saying, men and women and this and that. But human expression, I'm like, things are interesting out here in the world. And I'm okay with that, personally. Very comfortable, actually. And like this idea of race, how do we pick it apart as a social construct? Does it disadvantage anyone to look at race for what it is, a creation? A set of hierarchical identities that are loosely based on the color of one's skin. And I say this, having met and known well people who would be considered different races but are just as dark as I. or, looking at two lighter skinned humans walking side by side and, noticing or hearing people try to guesstimate what they are. What they are. Again, like even reducing people to objects as opposed to the very humans they are. It's all problematic to me. But I think that not the short film, but like the first episode of Race, the Power of an Illusion, points to some of the answers around this. But I think that what impacts this conversation much better, aside from the duration of that documentary, there are 3 parts, and we'll go through episode 1 this week, episode 2 next week, and during week 4, episode 3. Is that, when we look at The History of White People by Nell Irvin Painter, she really unpacks this idea of the creation of races, looking at some of the scientists and other important thinkers during their times who try to rationalize this difference and how they, in turn, or, like maybe even future generations of them, in turn, use those rationalizations about race to begin to disenfranchise different groups. And so that's why we're starting there, because there's an important history there, especially when it comes to who begins to have access to this idea of whiteness. And as I point out in the lecture beyond this point, ethnicity and race are very different things. You can be a Black person, but you probably aren't necessarily African American. You could be Nigerian American. You could be a Jamaican Canadian person, or just a Jamaican. I'm not sure if they say Jamaican Canadian up there, so I won't even say that. But there are many different diverse identities that you can be within this so-called Blackness that we speak about. And when I say so-called Blackness, that sounds blasé, but I, for one, embrace being Black. It's something I inherited as a part of my socialization. And it's also a major part of how I've began to shape my identity in the context of this country and the world. So there's no shame, even though just because we accept something doesn't mean it's beyond scrutiny or question. But beyond that, the other 2 texts by Ibram Kendi and Ronald Takaki, who are brilliant, just as brilliant as Dr. Painter, are focused on case studies of Americans grappling with being targets of racism. Kendi's book specifically looks at the Black experience with anti-Black racism and its various manifestations, whereas Takaki's book offers this rich tapestry of stories from European immigrants to people coming from the eastern portion of Asia, to like people grappling with adjusting to the society after enslavement, people of African descent who were the descendants of Africans, or people from the African continent who were forced to assimilate to American culture and European cultures as well, considering the early experience. And within that, we get stories of life along the southern U.S. border, life after September 11th in this country for Muslim Americans and people who practice Islam in this country. Stories of like people who, have all these different rich experiences and they're grappling with belonging and exclusion, legal exclusion or social exclusion in some form or another in this country. And this will be our study of racism for the semester. I wanted to make it as holistic as possible so that we got a portrait of some of the experiences of every group. But I wanted to be intentional about making sure the stories are hopeful. The stories do encourage us to look at and question some of the ideas we're learning, some of the things that have impacted the past of these people to get to where they are. And also like to get us to think deeply. And I really look forward to some of your responses to the film Precious Knowledge. because as a person whose experience on the surface level is disconnected to the young students and teachers who fought for their Raza Studies department, it does resonate with me as a person who has loved and appreciated and now works professionally in a ethnic studies department. I'm like, yeah, those kids should have their department, but their state and city don't think they should. But we'll talk more about that in a few weeks. And I think that's not week 14. That's a lie. That's like week 10, week 9, 8, whatever. It's been a long day, y'all. But I'm very excited to work with you this semester. Finally, before I cut myself off about this week's course material, all of these things, Bobby Harrell, Race, the Power of an Illusion, really lead into a discussion about Ashley Woody Doan's article, What is Racism, Race Discourse, and Race Politics. This article, again, as I point out in the syllabus, 15 years ago is a long time, as is like 10 years ago, 11 years ago. And that was around the time Barack Obama was elected. So we're in a very, very different America now. But what's interesting about Woody Doan's article, which is released 2 years before the 2008 election, is that he's picking apart this language, like these very small nuances about what is racist, what isn't racist. And he, who happens to be white, and he happens to be a mentor of mine, and I'm not telling him that I'm assigning this article at all. He would be mortified, even though he's very proud of his work, but you wouldn't want to. He's like, no, don't. But it's a very specific take on some of the things he's noticed, especially as a white person with an investment in anti-racism, in addition to be a sociologist, on the manipulations of language around racism. There are breakdowns I could give. I don't like splitting hairs. In the past I have, and it just seems futile. But there are differences between racism and bigotry and prejudice, right? Bigotry and prejudice are individualized. It's me to you. I hate you. And I don't like you because of how you present, who you are, whatever. And racism itself as a system takes on a completely different form. But there's an argument for both to be a thing. Racism can be a series of abuses or harassments that is individualized. I wouldn't dare not call the murder of James Byrd in 1997 racist because it's an individualized act. However, I'm more reluctant to, again, embrace those conversations where I'm like, hey, have you considered this thing? Or, that thing is racist. Or, I think what happened there is, kind of messed up or racist. And, sometimes white people look at me strange and people return to me like, that's racist. Why are you always bringing up race? So I think that beyond my rambling, Dr. Doan, who's very clear in his article, points out some of the nuances and dangers of being quick to ascribe racism to everything. And so I am looking forward to some of your feedback on what he's written, because it's actually a very clear piece, and he makes his position clear in the end. And I think it was an interesting case study that is challenging to read and can cause you to think. I stopped myself a few times like, this is interesting, especially since it's all evidence-based. Harrell doesn't give us that too much. But definitely the documentary and definitely Dr. Doan's article as a sociologist and anti-racist worker do point to that. So I'm very much so looking forward to the things you have to say and want to express. And I also hope that the weather is as nice wherever you are in the world, and specifically if you're in Southeast Michigan, as it is here in Connecticut today. It's beautiful. Oh my gosh, I'm not wearing socks. But anyway, wishing you all the best. I'll see you again in the forums. I'm going to have dinner and take a nap, and I'll return to the forums tonight. So take care and have a good night, you all. Bye. And my camera just fell. It's been a day, y'all. Bye.